There are some common mistakes that I frequently see with cyclists who are going long, and we're talking more than just the 1 or 2 hour spin around the neighbourhood. These mistakes have the potential to completely ruin training sessions, sportives, and races, and they can make the cycle go from really fun to totally and make you question whether you want to get out on a bike again. Thankfully, there's a way to make sure that your cycles stay productive and enjoyable. And in this video, I'm going to show you how, so that by the end of it, you'll know what mistakes you might have been making and how you can fix them. You might find some of these quite surprising and how such simple changes can make such a big difference. And if you're new here, then hey, my name is James. I'm a registered sport and exercise nutritionist. I work with amateur and professional endurance athletes to help them train and race better, improve their recovery, and do all of this in a healthy fashion. I love this topic because it has the potential to completely transform your long bike rides. I actually had a client who I spoke to recently about their long cycle. They were feeling pretty grotty and weak towards the end of a 4-hour ride, and after the ride they felt sick and they didn't really want to eat. But by improving their nutrition, they felt way better. They felt stronger on the bike and improved their recovery too. And you'll be able to do the same. The place that we need to start is energy, how your body uses it, stores it, creates it. Now, cyclists usually love this topic, even if they don't know that they do, and perhaps they don't enjoy it in quite the same nerdy way as me. But they love chatting over their coffee stop about fat burning, carbs, and the best way to fuel your cycling. Now, when you cycle, you have 2 major sources for energy, and that's fats and carbohydrates. Now, almost regardless of what intensity you're cycling at, you'll use a combination of the 2 for energy, but the larger proportion will be carbohydrates. The average person has over 50,000 calories worth of energy stored as fat, which is essentially unlimited because you're not going to be able to use up that store before you have to collapse or get off the bike because your butt hurts too much. However, the average person only has about 2,500 calories worth of energy stored as carbohydrates, so as something called glycogen, and that's only if you're fully stocked up to start with after following a carbohydrate loading protocol. In context, this is about 90 minutes worth of top-end effort, or perhaps a couple of hours worth of slower cycling if you had carb loaded to the max. Now, if you run out of carbohydrates, you'll bonk or hit the wall. And what this means is that your stored carbohydrates get to such a low level that you can't maintain the same pace or power, and you'll have to slow down and you will feel dreadful. So that's usually the feeling towards the end of your bike ride, where you feel like you're pedaling through treacle and your head feels a bit fuzzy. Some of you sadistic people love that feeling, and I have no doubt that I'll get comments like, that's part of the process, it's better to do that in training, you know who you are. But honestly, this is not the right approach, and I really wouldn't recommend it. So in terms of what your nutrition focus should be during cycling, hopefully it's clear that if we're purely talking numbers and what stores you have available or what might run out, your focus should be on carbohydrates. But the other thing to say here to just round this section out is that for the majority of cyclists, carbohydrates are the optimal fuel source for performance. If you want to cycle as well as you can, then you need carbohydrates. So please don't go low carb or follow a ketogenic diet unless you have a specific reason to do that and you have worked with a registered professional. And yes, this does apply even if you're doing really long cycles. Even when you're cycling at a slow, steady pace, you're going to be using a significant amount of your body's glycogen stores or carbohydrates, and you need to keep these up. Now, I am going to give you some energy calculations later on in the video and link to some practical examples. But first, let's start at the place that lots of cyclists get wrong, and that's what to eat before your long ride. Breakfast is super important because it is a huge factor in how well your long ride goes, how energized you feel, and how you recover afterwards. Before any ride, I would always suggest having at least 30 grams of carbohydrates. And if you can tolerate more and have time, more is going to be better. Going for a long cycle is demanding, and starting in a fasted state is only going to make this harder. I've put the carbohydrate amount of some common foods up on the screen for you, so you get an idea of how this 30 grams looks in practical terms. You can experiment with your breakfast here, and there is honestly no universally best breakfast. As long as you're hitting your carb numbers, then you're good. Cycling is easier than a sport like running, which means you can be a bit more lenient with your breakfast. So usually with running, I'd say you should definitely limit the amount of fat and fiber in your breakfast. But this isn't as important with cycling because you don't have the mechanical bouncing of running. But if you are prone to tummy problems, then I'd suggest reducing the amount of fat, fiber and protein in your pre-ride meal, and that should help. For some clarity here too, it's absolutely fine to have gels before cycling. They're just easy to absorb forms of carbohydrates and are going to be used immediately by your body for energy. Plenty of cyclists and triathletes that I've worked with have done this before their long rides. For example, if they're short on time in the morning. I'd also normally suggest having 500 milliliters of water with your breakfast if you have a decent amount of time before you ride. If you're pretty much just getting up and heading out of the door, then a swig or two of water would be fine as long as you've got your fluid with you during the ride. We'll talk about hydration during the ride later, but for now, let's go through what to eat during your long ride. One of the biggest mistakes that I see with cyclists is that they wait until they're feeling hungry or tired to start eating. But actually, this is way too late. Now, you know the kind. And you might actually be one of them who likes to just drink water and then admits to themselves halfway through that things are getting really hard, but you don't want to tell anyone. If you remember those carb stores, which are called glycogen, and how they get used up as you ride, if you're getting to the point where you're running low, then it's already too late. There's a lag time between eating something and then being able to use that for energy. So you want to try and stay ahead of this curve and never get to that point. And if you want your long rides to be productive and actually get the most benefit out of them, then you need to have a fueling plan and start early. My usual recommendation during long training rides, where it is a genuinely easy intensity, is 30 grams of carbohydrates per hour if you're cycling up to about 4 hours. This should be enough to keep your carb stores up and make it a productive session. However, you'd benefit from more like 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour for anything over 4 hours, or for longer rides which also include high intensity blocks. So let's say a 4-hour ride with lots of hill work thrown in there too. Now in terms of how you get to this, I've put the carbohydrate content of some common foods that people eat when cycling, so you can see how you might get to that amount. Just like breakfast, you can eat whatever suits you here as long as you get to those required carb amounts and it doesn't cause any stomach upset. Now with cycling, again, unlike running, you could definitely include some fat or protein in the food that you eat and be more flexible with your choices and use things like bars or bananas or really anything else you fancy. The same risk for stomach upset just isn't as strong with cycling as it is with running. But if you're cycling for longer than 6 hours, then it is definitely worth consuming some protein alongside your carbs. When you start doing these longer rides, you get some muscle breakdown, in part simply due to the duration, but also because your body has its normal physiological functions to carry out, and some of these require protein to fuel. The normal source of this protein is from food, but if it doesn't have access to any, then it will start breaking some muscle tissue down and use the protein from that. Sports bars or cereal bars are a really easy way to do this, but breaded goods or nut butter balls also work really well here. Now, it's worth addressing a big barrier to fueling your long rides properly, and this is where you really need to listen up if you like to talk about this sort of stuff over coffee with your mates. For a lot of people, what I've just suggested might seem mad high in terms of the amounts of carbohydrates that I'm suggesting you consume. And I mean, do you really need to consume that many carbs? Like, is it really worth it? And normally, a connected question is it actually better to reduce the carbs you consume and instead focus on metabolizing or burning fat? Now, the short answer here is yes, you should consume this many carbs, and no, it isn't better to reduce carbs to focus on metabolizing fat. It's obviously a bit more nuanced than that, so let's dig into it, and let's get a biggie out of the way. you can still improve your fat metabolism while consuming carbohydrates. I see so many comments on this YouTube channel from people who suggest that you should avoid carbs in training, encourage a bonk, focus on metabolizing fat, and all the different aspects of this. In theory, the idea of burning more fat is fantastic because it would mean you have more access to that near unlimited store of fat and make you less reliant on carbohydrates. So what happens is these people reduce their carbs, they gradually work their way up to multiple hours of riding fasted, and they say they feel great for it. But the thing is that you really don't need to. You can still burn fat for fuel even when consuming carbohydrates during cycling, and there is no good data to show that there's a better training response if you restrict them, and in fact there's quite the opposite. Remember at the start I mentioned that you'll use carbs even when you're doing slow, easy training. And remember that you have a limited amount of those carbs available, and that as those stores get lower, you get to the point where you bonk or hit the wall. So clearly you don't want that to happen, as you want your rides to be as productive and beneficial as possible. Well, consuming carbs is the way to do that, so it should take priority over restricting them from your diet. And actually, one of my favorite but also kind of sad things to hear about people who focus on this fat burning is that they highlight their own nutrition issue without realizing it. They mention that they will feel like they have limitless energy on flat rides and feel amazing, but they often struggle with the hilly ones. This is almost always in part due to their nutrition. To be able to go up hills, you need carbohydrates because the relative intensity is going to be higher, which means you have to use carbs, and there's no way around this. And for those of you who like the honest truth, the best way to improve your fat metabolism is to train consistently over time. If you want to become a good fat burner, you ride for years, and this is way more influential than anything else and is far better than trying to swap to a low-carb diet or any other diet hack. And in order to cycle consistently for years, you fuel your rides well so that you recover well, you feel amazing, and you can hit your week-on-week mileage aims. Now back to the question of, do you need to consume as many as 30 to 100 grams of carbs per hour? Yes, definitely, because that's the sort of region that will help keep your glycogen stores up during your training rides. Now you might have seen that you have somewhere between 2,000 to 2,500 calories worth of energy stored as carbohydrate, ready to be used for energy. Now, that's absolutely true in the most part, but that's only if you follow a carb load protocol, which is following a strict regime of eating between 8 to 10 grams of carbs per kilo of body weight per day for around 36 hours. Now, most people don't do this for their average training ride, so they might have more like 1,600 calories of glycogen stored when you account for previous training and just normal daily life. The other thing to mention here is that whilst you might have 2,000 calories worth of glycogen stored at a max, it's not as simple as saying that that's available for energy. Your body is not going to use all of that for energy because it starts to notice when its glycogen stores are low, and it puts the brakes on because it knows that if it drops too low, then that's dangerous because this is essentially hypoglycemia, so low blood sugar levels. So it says, nah, we need to slow down. Now, this is very individual, but let's say that your body is actually going to save around 500 calories worth of glycogen as protection. Your working amount on that training ride might be more like 1,100 calories worth of stored carbohydrate, rather than that 2,000 or 2,500 number that you might see floating around on the internet or in other videos. So this would, in combination with burning fat, only sustain you for a couple of hours of cycling at an easy pace. It's hard to give an exact amount of carbohydrates that you might burn per hour because everyone is different and it depends on your ability to metabolize fat and carbs for energy. If you're interested in your own numbers, then you can consider doing metabolic testing at a local university or sports facility, and that way you'll get way more nuanced information. But let's say you go out for an easy training ride and you use something like a 50-50 split of carbs to fat. And this is realistic, by the way, and some people might have a much worse ratio than that and burn way more carbohydrates. You're burning roughly 600 calories per hour, which means around 300 calories are coming from carbohydrates. There's 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate, meaning you use around 75 grams of carbs per hour. Over 4 hours, that's 300 grams of carbohydrates, which is 1,200 calories. Now, these are all rough figures, but hopefully you can now see why these calculations are actually way more significant. Because people are dramatically overestimating their carbohydrate stores and underestimating their carbohydrate needs during long cycling. But what I'd really love for you to get from this is that fueling your long rides is important and beneficial. If you want to get better, you need to train consistently over time, and fueling your body properly is going to be key to this. If you're interested in improving your bike nutrition, then you can download my free cycling fueling guide. Link is in the description of this video. It'll take you through the key concepts of cycling nutrition so that you can train and recover better. So go and grab it now. So now let's move on to hydration during your long rides, and we'll put a figure here of anything over 4 hours. And I say that because generally speaking, anything under 4 hours, your body is pretty good at dealing with, and the need for specific fluid plans is less important. It may still be necessary depending on factors such as your sweat rate, how hilly a ride you're doing, and what the temperature is, but less so. Usually something like a minimum of 300 milliliters of water per hour is fine, and then just drinking to thirst. But let's say you're gonna ride for longer than 4 hours, so fluid and electrolyte intake, specifically sodium, starts to become more important. I'd love to run you through the basic physiology of blood and sweat because it gives context for hydration, why it's so important, including sodium. Now, a large component of your blood is made up of water, which is why you get the advice to drink when you exercise. When you sweat, you lose water from your blood, which reduces your blood volume, and you also lose sodium through sweat, as well as through urine. The result of having this lower blood volume means that your heart has to work harder, with the main change that it beats faster. And you might have noticed that you have a higher heart rate when you're dehydrated, and this is one of the reasons. Then, because your blood volume is lower, you have less blood being sent to your gut, because it's instead being sent to your vital organs to keep them safe and functioning. This means you can't absorb as much nutrition, and it also means that your capacity for cooling is reduced, resulting in a higher core temperature and a reduced sweat rate. All of this as a combination is the physiological basis for why dehydration affects performance. Now, sodium is the most important electrolyte, and that's because of its link to water and your circulatory system. Other electrolytes like magnesium, potassium, calcium are all important for your health, but there's no good evidence to support replacement during exercise, and so it's not something that I would suggest as necessary for you during your cycles. Now, cyclists can generally tolerate much higher fluid amounts per hour than runners, so when it comes to hydration during your long rides, anywhere between 400 milliliters to 1,000 milliliters of fluid per hour is great, and this is individual and it depends on what you're comfortable with and what you feel you need. More is usually better, so finding out your max in training and for racing is helpful. Along with that amount of fluid, you should be consuming at least 250 milligrams of sodium per 500 milliliters of fluid. Now, you might notice that it's a bit different to carbohydrates, in that carbs are grams of carbs per hour, whereas sodium is per liter of fluid. That's because sodium intake is independent of time and instead should scale with the amount of fluid that you drink. The reason behind this is that it's the amount of sodium in your blood, and remember that a large amount of your blood is made up of water, and just drinking plain water can dilute the amount of sodium in it, causing something called hyponatremia, which can be dangerous, especially during your long cycle rides. So the basic principle is that if you drink more fluid, you should be consuming more sodium too, and you can do this in 3 ways. The first is using a pre-made hydration drink, as these typically contain at least 250 milligrams of sodium per serving, and are meant to be mixed with 500 milliliters of water. If not, then your second option is to add sodium to it yourself. You can use sport-specific electrolyte tablets or add table salt to get to the required amounts. Table salt contains 40% sodium and 60% chloride, which means that if you're using 1 gram of table salt, it will contain 400 milligrams of sodium. So if you see salt on a nutritional label, just take 40% of that and you'll find out how much sodium it contains. Now, the third and final option is to use sodium capsules during your ride. Let's say you were using a carbohydrate drink mix and it didn't contain much sodium and you didn't want to add any to the solution. You could just take sodium tablets with you and you could scale how many you consume based on how much fluid you're drinking. None of these options are necessarily better. It's just finding out what works best for you. Now, there's obviously a lot to take on board here, but if you get this right, it can make such a huge difference to your cycling, so I hope you find it useful. Now, as well as what you consume during your long rides, recovery afterwards is also super important, and you can watch this video for some amazing snack options to help you boost your recovery and improve your next training session.